Jake had one rule. His garage was his sanctuary, his space, his rules. So when he pulled into his driveway that evening, expecting the usual peace, and instead felt the deep, gut-punching bass vibrating through his car windows, he knew something was wrong, very wrong. His foot barely hit the brake before a sharp voice cut through the air, loud, commanding, and way too enthusiastic. And left, right, spin. Let's go, ladies. Jake froze. What the hell? His heart thumped as he reached for the garage remote, dread curling in his stomach. The door lifted, inch by inch, revealing a scene so absurd, so mind-numbingly insane, that he nearly dropped his coffee. 15 women, bright neon leggings, jumping, spinning, sweating, all over his garage floor. And there, standing like a dictator in a tracksuit, was Karen, HOA Karen, smirking, arms crossed, looking like she had just conquered new territory. Jake blinked. His workbench, still there. His tools, untouched. His bike, hanging exactly where he left it. So why the hell did his garage look like a full-blown Zumba studio? His brain refused to process it. But Karen? She was waiting. She clapped her hands together, beaming. Oh, good. You're here. Jake didn't move. He didn't speak, because he already knew this wasn't just some mistake. Karen had planned this. And if there was one thing Jake was sure of, this was about to get a whole lot worse. Jake folded his arms, standing his ground. Karen, I'm not going to ask again. What is going on? She exhaled like he was the one being difficult. It's simple, really. She gestured around, as if his garage was some grand hall instead of a place meant for his tools and his belongings. The HOA voted to repurpose underutilized spaces for community events. Your garage was the perfect choice. Jake's eyebrows shot up. Underutilized. He pointed at his workbench. I use this garage every day. Karen just smiled, that same smug, I know better than you expression that made his blood pressure rise. Oh well, we had a vote. He scoffed. What vote? I never heard anything about this. Karen's smirk didn't waver. That's because you weren't there. Jake clenched his jaw. I wasn't there because no one told me. Karen let out a theatrical sigh, as if dealing with a child. We put up a notice. Yeah, right. There was never a notice. If there had been, he would have set it on fire. Jake took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice level. You can't just take someone's property and decide it belongs to the neighborhood. Karen rolled her eyes. Jake, no one took anything. It's still technically yours. We're just sharing it. He stared at her, stunned. Sharing it. Exactly, she said, as if he had finally caught on. This is about community engagement, fitness, wellness. You should be happy to contribute. Happy to contribute? Jake looked around. The women were still bouncing around his garage, following the off-key commands of their instructor, completely unfazed by the fact that they were trespassing. He turned back to Karen, his patience razor-thin. This isn't a community center. This is my house, my garage, my property. Karen folded her arms, eyes gleaming with false sympathy. Jake, this is why people think you're so uncooperative. His eye twitched. Uncooperative? Yes, she said, nodding, her voice oozing condescension. The neighborhood thrives when we work together, when we help each other. She placed a hand on her chest. And as the head of the HOA, it's my job to make sure everyone does their part. Jake pinched the bridge of his nose. Karen, this isn't doing my part. This is theft. Karen let out a dramatic gasp. Jake, don't be so extreme. We're all neighbors. She gestured to the group behind her, still jumping, spinning, and sweating all over his floor. This is for everyone. Before he could respond, there was a knock at the doorframe. Paul. Jake exhaled sharply. Of course. Paul was a middle-aged guy with a clipboard and a cheap security vest. He lived 3 houses down and was one of Karen's most loyal lackeys. Hey, Paul scratched the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact. Karen called, said we had a disturbance. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, Paul. The disturbance is them in my garage. Paul shifted uncomfortably. Well, Karen says it's an HOA-approved event. Jake narrowed his eyes. And do you see any proof of that? Paul glanced at Karen, who was smiling like she had already won. Well, she's the HOA president. Jake's fists clenched. Paul, I don't care who she is. This is my house, and I never agreed to this. Karen let out another exaggerated sigh. Paul, don't mind him. He's just overreacting. He'll get used to it. Jake had had enough. He turned to Paul. So what? You're just going to let them take over my space? Paul shrugged. I mean, the rules say the HOA can use community spaces. Jake laughed sharply. Community spaces. Paul, this is my private property. Paul looked at Karen. Karen looked at Paul. Neither said anything. Jake exhaled through his nose. Fine, he muttered. You want to play this game? Let's play. Karen tilted her head. Jake, don't be difficult. Jake met her gaze, his voice ice cold. Oh, I haven't even started. Jake spent the night making sure Karen wouldn't pull the same stunt again. New locks, security cameras, double-checked everything. If she and her neon-clad army tried stepping foot in his garage again, they were in for a surprise. Morning arrived, and Jake sat by the window, steaming cup of coffee in hand, waiting. 8 a.m. sharp. Like clockwork, Karen marched up the driveway, flanked by her usual group of enthusiastic exercisers. She moved with purpose, head held high, confidence radiating off her like she actually owned the place. She grabbed the garage handle and pulled. Nothing. She frowned and yanked again. The door didn't budge. Jake sipped his coffee, smirking. Karen turned to her group, her brows knitting together. Did someone mess with this? A few shrugs, shaking heads. Nobody knew. She tried again, jiggling the handle with growing frustration. Her face shifted from confusion to irritation. She stepped back, crossing her arms, staring at the locked door like it had personally offended her. Then, just as expected, her phone came out. Jake's rang. He let it vibrate on the table, untouched. Karen's head snapped up toward his house, her nostrils flaring. Without hesitation, she stomped up the front steps and began pounding on the door. Boom, boom, boom. Jake, open up. He took another sip, savoring the moment, before finally strolling over. He cracked the door open just enough to meet her furious gaze. Morning, Karen, he said casually. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Why is the garage locked? Jake blinked. Because it's my garage. Karen gasped like he had just committed a crime. You can't do that. You're obstructing a community event. Jake leaned against the doorframe. Community event? You mean trespassing? Karen scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. The HOA approved the space for group activities. Jake tilted his head. Strange. I don't remember signing any agreement allowing that. Karen's eye twitched. The board approved it. Jake let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. Ah, you mean you and your little HOA friends. Karen's face turned red. That's how the system works, Jake. We make decisions in the best interest of the neighborhood. Jake nodded slowly. Right? And what happens when someone doesn't agree? Karen straightened her shoulders. Then they need to learn how to be a team player. Jake chuckled. Karen, I'm all for teamwork, but not when it means letting you steal my garage. Karen clenched her fists. You are being unreasonable. No, Karen, Jake said, voice cool. I'm setting boundaries. For a moment, silence. Then Karen pulled out her clipboard, because of course she had one. She flipped through a few pages, found what she wanted, and jabbed a finger at it. You are in violation of community cooperation guidelines. This could result in an official HOA fine. Jake let out a sharp laugh. Oh no, how will I ever recover? Karen's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. Unless you unlock that garage and allow access, you'll be fined $500. Jake didn't even try to hold back the grin. $500? That's adorable. Karen's smirk faltered. It doubles if unpaid within 24 hours. Jake crossed his arms. Karen, I'm curious. Have you actually read the HOA bylaws? She scoffed. I wrote them. Jake pointed to her clipboard. Then you should know you can't fine me over $100 without an official homeowner vote. Karen's entire body stiffened. Jake smiled. Oops. Her nostrils flared. This isn't over. I didn't think it was, Jake said, stepping back. But you're not getting my garage. Karen glared at him for another long second before spinning on her heel and storming off. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. She wasn't giving up. She'd be back, and he'd be ready. 2 days passed without any signs of Karen. But Jake knew better than to think she had given up. Then, right on schedule, he stepped outside one morning and found something taped to his front door. A bright yellow envelope flapped in the breeze, practically glowing with self-importance. Jake ripped it off, unfolded the paper inside, and sighed. Compliance violation notice. Dear homeowner, you are in violation of community cooperation policies by obstructing an approved neighborhood activity. Failure to comply may result in further action. At the bottom, Karen's signature was bold and underlined, like she thought that made it official. Jake chuckled. Unbelievable. He wasn't about to play her little HOA fine game, but now she was escalating things. Something didn't sit right. He pulled out his phone, opened his security app, and scrolled through the footage from last night. And there she was, Karen, standing outside his garage in the dead of night, flanked by 2 of her loyal minions, whispering like they were part of some top-secret operation. Jake squinted. What was she holding? Then, as if the situation couldn't get any more ridiculous, Karen pulled something out of her oversized purse. Bolt cutters. Jake sat back, blinking at the screen. Was she seriously about to break into his garage? Karen gripped the handles, ready to snap the lock. But before she could, one of the women beside her leaned in, whispering something urgent. Karen froze. Jake zoomed in, watching her expression shift from determined arrogance to mild panic. She scowled, hesitated, then shoved the bolt cutters back into her bag like nothing had happened. A moment later, they scurried off into the night. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. She's actually insane. She had gone from bossing people around to attempted breaking and entering. And that's when he knew. Karen had no intention of backing down. She was playing dirty. So fine. She wanted a war? She was about to get one. Jake leaned back in his chair, staring at his laptop screen, a slow grin spreading across his face. If Karen wanted to steal his garage, she was about to regret it. After a few quick searches, he found exactly what he needed. A commercial-grade foam machine, industrial strength, enough to turn his entire garage into a sea of bubbles. One overnight delivery later, the machine arrived. A massive, heavy-duty contraption capable of producing a ridiculous amount of foam. Jake set it up, testing a small burst. Within seconds, thick, white suds poured out, covering the floor in a light, fluffy layer. Perfect. Now for the bait. He left the garage door unlocked and taped a handwritten note to the outside. Welcome to the new community event. Enjoy. Then he sat back, coffee in hand, waiting. 8 a.m. sharp. Like clockwork, Karen and her sweaty, spandex-covered army stormed up the driveway. She strutted forward, eyes gleaming with victory. I knew he'd come to his senses, she said, tossing her hair as she yanked open the garage door. The moment she stepped inside, Jake pressed the button. Boom! Foam erupted from every corner, blasting out in thick, rolling waves. Within seconds, the entire garage turned into a giant, frothy disaster. Karen let out a high-pitched screech as the foam swallowed her ankles, then her knees. The dancers panicked, slipping and flailing as they tried to escape. Jake watched from the doorway, grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. Karen stumbled, lost her footing, and face-planted straight into the bubbles. The sight was glorious. By now, the neighbors had gathered, cameras out, recording the chaos. Even the mailman stopped to watch. Jake raised his cup in a mock toast. Great turnout, Karen. Community events are important. She spluttered, soaking wet, fuming. "Turn it off." Jake cupped a hand around his mouth. "What? You don't like it? I thought you wanted a fitness space." Karen tried to charge forward, only to slip again, arms flailing wildly before crashing back into the foam. The laughter from the crowd grew louder. The video was already going viral. Jake had won. But Karen? She was just getting started. Karen clawed her way out of the foam, dripping, furious, and looking like a drowned cat in neon workout gear. The neighborhood? Losing it. Laughter echoed from driveways. Phones were out, cameras rolling. Even the mailman stopped mid-route, shaking his head and grinning. Karen wiped suds from her face, eyes locking onto Jake like he had just personally destroyed her entire existence. "Turn off." Jake took a slow sip of his coffee. "Oh, but Karen, isn't this a community event?" A fresh wave of chuckles rippled through the crowd. Someone clapped. Karen's nostrils flared. She turned to her loyal fitness crew, expecting backup, but most of them were already scrambling out of the foam, soaked and embarrassed. A few shook their heads, clearly done with her nonsense. One woman in a purple headband waded toward her, holding back a smirk. Karen, maybe we should take the class somewhere else." Karen spun on her, face twisted with outrage. "We are not leaving. This is an approved HOA event." Jake leaned against his car. "Right? And so was this." Karen let out something between a growl and a frustrated shriek, then turned on her heel and stormed off. Jake watched her go, still smirking. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, Jake stepped outside to grab his mail. The moment he opened the door, his stomach dropped. Taped to his front door was another HOA notice. This one wasn't just a fine. It was an eviction attempt. "Dear homeowner, due to repeated violations of community standards and failure to comply with HOA regulations, your property has been flagged for mandatory review. Further action will be determined at an emergency board meeting." Jake burst out laughing. She actually thought she could kick him out of his own home. He pulled the paper off the door, shaking his head. She was desperate. That meant one thing. Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting. She was going for the nuclear option. Jake cracked his knuckles. Fine. If she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. Jake walked into the HOA meeting with zero doubts about how this was going to end. Karen, on the other hand, sat at the front of the room, legs crossed, chin lifted, smirking like she had already won. She barely glanced at him as he took a seat. Instead, she turned to Bob, the HOA president, and gave him a sweet, practiced smile. "Bob, I think we should begin." Bob cleared his throat and shuffled through his papers. "All right, folks, we're here today because of, he glanced at Jake. An incident involving excessive foam. A few people stifled laughter. Karen shot up from her chair. "This is not a joke," she snapped. "This individual has been actively defying HOA policies, obstructing approved community events, and creating a hostile living environment." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Hostile? I gave you a bubble bath." Karen's eye twitched. "That was a public safety hazard." Bob held up a hand. All right, let's go one at a time." He turned to Jake. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Jake smirked. "I do, actually." He pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and projected the security footage onto the meeting room screen. Crystal clear video played. Karen, standing outside his garage with bolt cutters in hand. The room fell silent. Bob blinked. Karen, what are we looking at here?" Karen went pale. That's taken out of context." Jake leaned back in his chair. "Oh, really? What's the right context for trying to break into my garage?" A low murmur spread through the room. A few HOA members exchanged looks. Bob sighed, rubbing his temples. "Karen, this is serious. Did you really attempt to enter his property without permission?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, searching for an excuse. "He was blocking a community event. I had to." Bob cut her off. "Karen, we can't enforce rules that weren't properly voted on." He flipped through a folder, frowning. Actually, now that I'm looking at this, a lot of these policies were never officially approved. Jake grinned. You don't say. Bob's frown deepened. Karen, you never had permission to make these rule changes. He looked up. The shared space rule? The fines? None of it went through a proper homeowner vote. Karen froze. Bob set the papers down and sighed. We're going to have to discuss your position on the board. Karen's entire body stiffened. You can't do this. I am the HOA. Bob shook his head. Not anymore. The room buzzed with whispers. Some members looked relieved. Others barely hid their smirks. Karen stood there, frozen, like her entire world had just crumbled. Then her expression twisted into pure fury. She spun on Jake, pointing a trembling finger. You think this is over? She hissed. Jake grinned. Oh, I know it is. With an angry screech, Karen grabbed her purse, stormed out, and slammed the door behind her so hard that a framed picture fell off the wall. Bob let out a long breath. Well, that happened. Jake stretched his arms behind his head. So, about that fine? Bob chuckled. Yeah, that's voided. Jake smirked. Good. I was thinking of spending that money on more foam. The room erupted in laughter. Karen was gone. Jake had won. But somehow he knew she wasn't done yet. Jake stepped outside, stretching as he breathed in the crisp morning air. Then he saw it. A for sale sign, right in Karen's front yard. He blinked, then grinned. She was leaving. Before he could fully process the beauty of the moment, a moving truck rumbled up the street and backed into her driveway. The doors swung open, and out stomped Karen, barking orders at the movers like a military commander. Her face was twisted in pure rage, but she wasn't screaming at them. No, this anger was directed at the universe itself. Jake casually leaned against his mailbox, coffee in hand. Morning, Karen. She froze. Her head turned slowly, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. You think this is funny? She snapped. Jake took a sip of his coffee, savoring the moment. Oh, I think it's hilarious. Her hands clenched into fists. Do you have any idea what you've done? He tilted his head. Oh, you mean exposing the fact that you illegally changed the HOA rules, tried to fine me for my own garage, and attempted to break into my property? He flashed a mock look of concern. Yeah, Karen, I have a pretty good idea. Her face burned red. You ruined me. Jake chuckled. Nah, you did that all by yourself. She let out an angry noise, somewhere between a growl and a frustrated screech, before spinning on her heel and storming back toward the truck. By now, the neighbors had gathered. One by one, people stepped outside, watching with wide grins as the movers hauled out her overpriced furniture. Some whispered excitedly, others just shook their heads, amused. Then someone clapped. Jake turned to see Mr. Hendricks from 3 doors down, standing on his porch in a bathrobe, giving a slow, satisfied round of applause. Another neighbor joined in, then another. Within seconds, half the street was clapping. Karen whirled around, eyes wild, horrified. You're all monsters, she shrieked. Jake chuckled. Nah, we just love a good community event. The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen stomped to her car, yanked the door open, and sped off, leaving a trail of dust and a ruined reputation behind. Jake sighed, watching the moving truck pull away. The neighborhood was finally free. Jake woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing nonstop. Half asleep, he grabbed it and squinted at the screen. Hundreds of notifications. His inbox was flooded. Messages, comments, shares, all about the foam party. He scrolled through the chaos, laughing at the sheer volume of people roasting Karen. HOA Karen really thought she was the final boss. My guy hit her with the ultimate counter move. This is the most satisfying revenge I've ever seen. It had gone viral. Karen's foam-covered meltdown was everywhere: Twitter, TikTok, Reddit. Even some online news sites had picked it up. Jake leaned back, watching the numbers skyrocket. People weren't just entertained. They had stories of their own. Comments poured in from all over the world. Dude, my HOA is just as bad. You should hear what mine pulled. Please tell me you have more stories. This needs to be a series. Jake, start a channel just exposing HOA Karens. Jake smirked. Maybe they were on to something. He grabbed his camera, hit record, and leaned in.